Good afternoon, everyone. This is Vernon Grimmy from the Division of Rehabilitation Services. We probably have a few more people that are just getting connected, but I'll do some introductory comments. I'm the Assistant Director with the Division of Rehab Services and putting this presentation together today for VR staff and the providers that we work with. Just to let everyone know that I am recording this session, that this session will be available for people to view. And if you're seeing the screen, which you should, it'll show you where you can download this presentation and the handouts, and also you can watch the video at a later time. Also, there are a couple of documents I may refer to during this presentation that you can access there. We're putting a lot of documents on the Division Rehab Services website, and if you go on the left-hand side, there's a tab called Provider Resources. So we put like template forms, we put our fee schedule there, we put our description services, and then we put all the recordings of our videos also on our website. I muted everyone, hopefully, and if you do need to want to ask a question later on, you can do a #6 will unmute, and *6 can mute your phone. I know some people are using their computer for the audio and the video, and sometimes you get a little echoing or feedback, especially if it's a laptop and the laptop is closed and the microphone and the speaker are on top of each other. So that's why I have people muted. I do recommend that people use that number that was provided on the announcement to call in that number and use that for audio. It seems to have less problems. Also, during the presentation, sometimes my headset just kind of quits for reasons unknown. If it does, there's a chat feature, and we're using Skype for Business. Please use the chat feature to let me know any of those things like that. Or if you have any questions during the presentation, that feel free to post your questions also on there. Otherwise, we also have an opportunity for questions that will be after each section and also at the end. We can give continuing education credits for this presentation. This will be typically for the certified employment support professionals or the rehabilitation counselors. What you'll have to do is at the end of the presentation, there's a survey link. You will need to go and do that, complete the survey link, and put your email address in there. Also, I will give 2 words during the conference presentation today that you will need to put in there to assure that you were listening to the presentation today. Okay, I am going to proceed with the presentation then, hopefully. Go slide. But you know, I don't want too many. The training today, I'm going to cover what I call the 3 E's: competitive integrated employment, the customized employment, and supported employment. And again, these definitions and the basis for my presentation today is going to be more on how VR is using these services and these definitions for reimbursement for providers. So it's really important that both the VR staff and providers both understand these definitions and how they apply in vocational rehabilitation. And I do want to also state that sometimes these definitions are used in other programs such as developmental disabilities, and they may have different scope of services or how they're funded may be differently. So just keep in mind my definitions and how I'm talking about today is specifically the vocational rehabilitation services. Also today, my presentations will be dealing a little bit more with the definitions and the policy ends. I'm not going to get into how do you do job coaching for supported employment or how do you do job placement for supported employment. I'm going to get into more of the definitions of what is supported employment, who's it for, the funding that is associated with it, and the policies that are associated with it. The reason that's driving these changes, at times you hear us talk about the Rehabilitation Act, and the origin of the Rehabilitation Act is now approaching its 100th anniversary. It started in 1918 as the Soldiers Rehabilitation Act, and throughout the past century has been modified and amended to our current legislation that we have today. And its last amendment was July 22nd, 2014, and it is now incorporated into the Workforce Opportunity and Innovation and Opportunity Act, where, like Title IV, they basically taken the whole Rehab Act and they put this in the WIOA federal legislation. So there are times that we'll refer just to the Rehabilitation Act, and that is a law that basically describes VR and gives us authority in how we operate. Furthermore, regulations follow when a law is put in place. And the VR and support employment regulations came out 2 years after the law was implemented. And so that's 8/19/2016. And I do have the links if people are really that interested in reading the regulations. I think it is important sometimes to have those available, and sometimes the presentation today I will have literally copied the definition of the regulation out. It's not my plan to read word for word the definitions, and I will just do some highlights or summarization of those, but I do think it's important at time that people see the full definition that's in the regulation or the act. Then following, when the regulations get done, you may see VR agencies do a series of policies to further define how this is going to apply in our states such as South Dakota. And I do have one policy that will be discussed today on competitive integrated employment. So the first one today talking about is competitive integrated employment. Now, first I do want to address that prior to the act and the regulations being revised, we always had competitive employment that was defined in the Rehabilitation Act, and we also had integration somewhat defined in integration and regulations. But that has changed with the new act and new regulations, because in the past it used to just have the opportunity for interaction with individuals without disabilities, and that has now changed into there. So there are basically three main requirements, components of competitive integrated employment. And you'll see us use this definition a lot throughout the VR program, because if it doesn't meet competitive integrated employment or towards that, it's services we cannot fund. So, anyway, with the three areas of competitive integrated employment, first of all, it has to be full or part-time work at minimum wage. Now, the wage has always pretty well been there. I think a few years ago we may have closed people successfully rehabilitated at less than minimum wage. That is now clarified we can't. And as far as part-time, there really is no specific number of hours, but we do address that when they are less than 10 hours a week, that our district supervisor is approving those closures, because we do want to see if a person was capable of working more than 3 or 4 hours a week, if we're going to count that as successful employment or not. Fully integrated with coworkers without disabilities, and I'll kind of talk a little bit more about this here a little bit later. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about all three of these in detail, because they are further defined in the Rehabilitation Act and the regulations. I do want to address also that when you go to the Provider Resources tab, you will see our program guide on competitive integrated employment. It's called DRS SPVI 2017-01, and we provided this for VR counselors. It does follow pretty well word to word of the regulations, but we did come up with an assessment form for the VR counselors to use if there are employment situations that are real questionable. Okay, the first part of competitive integrated employment is the first leg of the definition. And again, it's very wordy the way it's written onto there. And of course, I mentioned earlier that it has to be at minimum wage or above. And you may realize that the South Dakota minimum wage is higher than what the federal minimum wage is. So we do have to follow the state minimum wage. It's not less than the customary rate that is paid for other employers, other employees. And I'm not going to talk too much about the self-employment because self-employment is kind of unique, where the counselors and I are discussing those situations before we even fund self-employment, because sometimes we'll see a proposal come in for a vending operation, for a pop machine situation for a person, and then which may work well for that, and then we see 3 or 4 more just like it, and they're not self-supporting or they don't provide any profit for the individual. So we are looking at those uniquely into there. And the last part of it is also the level of benefits has to be, the individual has to be eligible for that same level of benefits as all other employees into there. Now, I do want to point out that there's times that when we get these definitions, it's most easiest to say, yes, this is customized competitive. This is competitive integrated employment when a person is hired and paid by Walmart or the local business. But sometimes there is these provider relationships where they are handling the payroll, and those are getting a little bit more complicated into there. The second part, typically found in the community where the employee disability interacts with purposes of with other employees. Now, this is excluding the job coach. So if you have 2 other workers in there and a job coach, the 2 other workers are individuals with disabilities, then it is not meeting that requirement of where they have that opportunity to interact or that work unit. And the third leg on here has that same opportunity for advancement as the other employees who are not individuals with disabilities. Now, I realize that in South Dakota that a lot of the small businesses don't have a lot of opportunities for employment, but you got to look at if this person was the same as all the employees, they would have that equal level of employment. I do want to back up one other thing here with this first leg, and the very last bullet on there is eligible for the level of benefits provided to other employees. I do want to point out that at times may include workers' compensation and may include unemployment insurance. And when individuals are handled through a payroll of a community support provider and they made a contract arrangements with a business, those benefits may not be happening into there. Okay. I'm just looking through my chat, see if any other questions so far. So the summary of competitive integrated employment is, again, typically contract arrangements through a provider do not meet this requirement. And, we will evaluate these unique situations on a case-by-case situation, but I'm just telling you, typically, that when there is the provider is handling the payroll, they're not meeting those requirements, even if they're being paid at minimum wage, because the individual may not have the same level of benefits or may not have the same level of opportunities advancement as other coworkers into there. I don't want to say that this prohibits providers from developing contracts or enclaves or group situations with businesses. Those can be very valuable for many individuals you're working with. I'm just saying that if VR is going to pay for these services, count this as a successful employment, these are requirements we have to meet into there. Because it's probably not possible that everyone is going to be able to work in an individual competitive integrated employment. Some people will need ongoing staff or supervision always there. Also, I do want to encourage that this does not include providers from hiring individuals with disabilities as staff. And, a lot of times providers don't even realize a person they hired is a VR client because they do have a disability, because they're probably typically working with individuals with intellectual disabilities and may not realize that the employee they hired as a job coach may have some other type of disability that made them eligible for voc rehab or into their group home or into their residential program. There's probably more people with disabilities hired in by the community support providers and mental health system than they may even realize that they have hired. Now that is kind of a summary of the requirements of competitive integrated employment. Again, I do want to address that we have a program guide and evaluation form that is available from our website. Our counselors had it for a while. We've used it on occasions, and we only use it when it's really when we need to determine, is this competitive integrated employment or isn't it? And so that is a tool that we use, and it has to be where the VR counselor is using it. It is not practical for a provider to evaluate the situation in the site because there's probably financial money associated with that, and the counselor needs to make that determination. At this time, I'm going to stop a few minutes, and if people have questions, you will have to do a #6 to unmute your phone, or if you want to put your question in the chat box, you sure can. But I do want to take a few minutes and pause, and I do want to talk about what questions you may have specifically with competitive integrated employment. And again, as you always have to remember, is sometimes people say, well, you used to do this in the past. Yes, we used to take closures for less than minimum wage. And yes, we used to fund job placement packages where there was group situations, enclave, mobile crews. Those things did happen in the past. But with the changes of the Rehabilitation Act and the changes of regulations, those things are not allowable anymore if the voc rehab funds are to be used into there. So at this time, I'm just going to open it up for questions on competitive integrated employment. This is the part where you ask questions. I sure hope people are online, and I haven't been talking to myself for the last 20 minutes. Okay, no questions in Yankton, so at least I'm...
Hello.
Yep.
Bernie?
Yes.
Hi, Bernie. Laura Newbert in Rapid City.
Hi, Laura.
How are you, sir?
Good.
Say, I'm having difficulty getting online with that link that you gave us. So I have been. I think it calls for Skype, but I'm looking for the Skype thing, and I can't seem to find you. So I can't even chat or ask questions. But the one thing I wanted to ask is, maybe I didn't understand this right, but recently I attended a training that showed an example of a Walgreens store where they had. Um, it looked like it was integrated employment. But I wasn't sure what the difference between it was and an enclave where it's a big store down south where they had all kinds of people with disabilities working there, but they also had other people. I mean, so uh, is that the difference? Is that they're completely integrated with another staff, or there's no separation at all, or?
Well, that's a good question because I'm going to tell you, like, even right now, Division of Rehab Services, I think if you'd look at the actual people we have with disabilities, it's probably 40%. And,
I see.
so we have a high percent into there. I think where the question comes in is the second bullet where it is at a location typically found in a community. And how my understanding is um, if it is a community support provider that is taking a group out to Walgreens and they're handling through the payroll of the community support provider, that's probably not going to meet that requirement of competitive integrated employment. Now, Walgreens hires people with disabilities, and they made a commitment that they're going to have 30% of their individuals with disabilities are going to be competitive integrated employment. Now, if they put those individuals all in one little area and then they hire you as a job coach to be there all the time, it may not meet that requirement.
Yes, okay. All right. I
Yeah.
was kind of wondering about that, how that worked, because I didn't think that was completely 100% the intent of the law,
Yeah.
or, the new. All right. Very good, sir. Thank you.
I seen another
And
question where
in the meantime,
someone's
yes, I'm.
first to answer your question on the computer link. People don't need Skype for business to view this presentation, and the Skype for business is not the same as your computer Skype. You should have been able just to click on that link or copy that link into your internet browser, whether you use an Internet
Oh,
Explorer
okay.
or what other thing you're using, and to run the presentation. And then it'll give you opportunity to just, do you want the video and audio both, or you just want video and stuff? So if you're having problems where you're saying you don't have Skype, um, copy that link into your Internet Explorer or your Google Chrome or whatever your browser that you may be using.
Oh, I just did it, and it still came up Skype for business. I got it.
Yeah, let's say Skype for
Okay,
business and
I'll
how do you
have
want to
to.
connect? Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Thank you,
Uh,
sir.
you bet. Other questions on competitive integrated employment? That's a good question. And I'll do a similar situation. What they defined is I know that centers for independent living, such like Independent Living Choices and Western Resources for Independent Living, have to have over 50% of the people with disabilities as staff. And I would see no problem with that meeting the requirements of competitive integrated employment. I think what you really need to ask yourself on these situations, are these individuals viewed as staff or are they viewed as individuals served? If they handled from your main agency payroll, are they invited to your agency's Christmas parties or other staffing events or after hours? Or they, what level of inclusion are they in those agencies? Would probably be a better way, almost to some ways, to define those. Okay. If you get any more questions, feel free just to put them in the chat, or again, ask Sam uh, during the presentation. I am going to move on to the next one, which is customized employment. Okay, customized employment. First of all, customized employment, this has not been a new terminology. It's been around for some time. We've done a lot of presentation in South Dakota and other states have done a lot of presentations. But you know what? It's never been defined in our federal law, the VR federal law, or the regulations until recently. And you know, there's three branches, main components onto here, and I'll go through them here in a minute. But it's customized employment is probably a very good tool when you're working with someone who continuously loses their employment or has been in a long-term sheltered employment. And what we found though is when we said customized employment, people have a different interpretation, especially VR counselors have a different interpretation than VR providers may have. And so that is imperative that we do get a better grip onto that. Now, there's a lot of different strategies and components and trainings on customized employment. And Wendy Parent Johnson from the Center of Disabilities is doing some trainings currently in place on the nuts and bolts and customized employment. But I'm going to go through these. The first one deals with based on the individual's determination, unique strengths and needs and interests. You know, this is looking more at, I'm going to call it discovery process. And you'll hear more about discovery in customized employment. And that is helping compile the information about the person. It's doing the person-centered planning information, the tools. It is doing the situational assessments. It's doing other types of interviewing family members, interviewing individuals, of compiling all that information of part of that discovery. The second bullet is now how do you take this information and to use it in a meaningful way that's going to benefit the individual and the business and employer. And I do want to mention that one of our presenters at the 2018 Fall Conference, October 9th, 11th in Aberdeen, we have Dr. Richard Looking will be presenting specifically on this about how to best use the discovery information. And of course, the third part is getting into carrying out the flexible strategies. When you start talking about job carving and customizing the supports and services for that individual onto there. Here's an example though of where I think if I would ask VR counselors on how a person and how they got their job was customized employment considered into their meeting the criteria and the full discovery process, they would probably answer it much different than how the provider would say they did it on almost all cases. But there is a significant difference in gap of communication of understanding and customized employment. And it leads to different interpretations, especially when, if we ever would identify money associated with customized employment, if that happened on a VR case. A couple additional requirements addressed with customized employment is, the additional requirements, it needs to occur within a community business as employer, and it also needs to include a discovery. And discovery is more than just kind of going through the past case notes or the past medical records of a person or the past work records and just summarizing them and putting them in a nice format. Discovery is really putting together more of a meaningful person-centered planning tools, interests the person will like, the interviews, and so there's a whole number of steps involved into there. I do have a document I put out on our website where this presentation will be also located, and it's called Essential Elements of Customized Employment. And I really found that to be one of the better resources that is currently available out there for providers to utilize. So what is discovery? Determination of that individual strengths, needs, and interests. Um, is there any background or research information to include into there? Is the view of the employment seekers description, also evaluating that employment seeker, the family, or other natural supports a person may have, and also really focusing on records pertaining to employment for the job seeker. Once in a while when I look at some case records and the person-centered planning tools that were used, they're they're probably just a form that was filled out and wasn't used in a meaningful way with the individual and with the family to help them understand their employment strengths and their interests and the supports that they have or the supports they may need on the job. So it really is taking a very thorough approach in getting this background information about the individual. I got a couple examples here of what is not customized employment. And the first one is a provider brings in a person to VR to apply on Monday for VR because the person has a job at ABC employer because a previous person with a disability lost a job. Well, that's not customized employment. That's filling a slot. And so, the employer is wanting a person to take over this job. And I know providers, if you're doing a good job out there of contacting employers and businesses, you probably have businesses that are contacting you also about this job opening. And sometimes it works to be a good fit, but sometimes if we're just trying to plug a person into it, it is not customized employment. I think the other thing is also to realize that maybe there was a previous individual that we did a job carving for and we did customize employment. Um, and if that person lost their job, it doesn't mean the person filling in for them um, is meeting a requirement. Again, also if let's say that you come across where employer contacts you, they want someone just to stand outside with a street sign at the Pizza Hut for a couple hours at noon every day, and so a job is carved out specifically like that. That's one piece of customized employment, but it's not the whole thing. So it may not include the discovery, it may not include the interview. So it's important that you include all components of the customized employment. So where do we go from here with customized employment? And I went through the definition already, but it's much more broader than that. And we need to come up with how we're going to document customized employment for VR and for the providers. Currently, our VR Faces, our case management system, has a checkbox for customized employment. And many other services we do, like job coaching, and when we authorize for job coaching and we pay for job coaching, it brings and follows all the way through a system, and it'll fill in that box already for the job coaching. But we don't have anything like that for customized employment right now, and we don't have it well defined into there. VR counselors can manually check that box. I think they have to do this quarterly on services if they feel it was occurring, that customized employment happened. But we're looking at developing more procedures and ways to document that. And so also we're also looking at customized employment and discovery across the VR and the DD descriptions of services. Because when you look at the discovery definition, and this person's in the developmental disability funding, there are areas in that the DD system is already funding this, but there may not be areas in where we could fund VR, could be doing it. So we need to, and I say we as Division of Developmental Disabilities and VR are working together on better defining whose role is on that in funding, and when does that separation end. Currently, Developmental Disabilities is putting together a toolkit, and we're also working with them on a memorandum of understanding to help define that role into there. We're hoping to clarify this maybe into the summer, and then to provide training to providers and VR counselors maybe in this fall. We're kind of looking there. And we also need to develop how we're going to track this in our VR system. We're also working on updating a memorandum I mentioned earlier with developmental disabilities, but also with mental health. And of course, that's going to be unique in a different situation. There's going to be some areas that their funding can do as part of the discovery, some areas it may not be. So the discovery is probably going to be the grayest area of who's responsible and when we're responsible in doing that. Okay, I mentioned earlier that there will be a survey at the end if you want continuing education credits, and there's going to be some words that you got to enter in on part of that survey. And of course, the first word is Eagles. And at this time, if there is any question on customized employment, I'd be happy to answer those questions on customized employment. None in Yankton. Okay, you just have to unmute your phone if you get a question, or if you do have, you can do it in the conversation, the chat part of it, or you can do like Laura did, just do the #6, and that will unmute your phone, and you can ask the question there. I do want to mention that Center for Disabilities, I forward announcement they recently had. They're looking for job coaches and employment specialists to participate in a research project to assess the outcomes of customized employment for job seekers with psychiatric disabilities. And the contact information is below. I do want to point out in my email when I send out, I did have an ed@usd.edu. It should be CD for Center Disabilities. So if you're interested in doing that, and there was a little flyer that came with it. They provided training. They provided some financial incentive. I wasn't sure if that was for the job seeker or the employment specialist, but they did have some incentive there, and I'm not sure how many employment specialists are looking for. But if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to pursue that option into there. Any questions? Otherwise, I'll proceed. Again, that'll be opportunity for questions at the end. I'm going to talk about support employment. That's the last E. And again, support employment has been around for ever since I've been in the VR field, almost 30 years. And needless to say, the regulations with support employment were about that old also. So it went quite a spell before the regulations for supported employment were recently updated into there. Now again, I just copied out the sections when it refers to supported employment on these topics. I'm not going to read them all word for word onto there, but this is how it's written in the Rehabilitation Act, where it gives the VR agency that programs the ability to use some funds that were specifically for supported employment. And you're going to see the terminology sometimes in my presentation, most significant disabilities. Those are individuals that Community support providers are would fall into that. You know, a person has to have the most significant disabilities. This is a classification that the VR counselor or determination that the VR counselor makes, but pretty well all the individuals on HCBS funding or other types of developmental disability funding fall into that category, and typically most people with Social Security benefits fall into that category. They did add some language this year, including youth with the most significant disabilities. I'll talk a little more about that later. Um, what that change has come about and what the intent into there. There is some definitions and some language in the supported employment now that doesn't quite apply to how South Dakota does business, mainly because South Dakota doesn't have a waiting list um, for developmental disabilities like many other states may have. And I think also we're fortunate that individuals that are going through the school system, that for the most part we're able to get onto the long-term support services once they age out at 21. Now you probably wonder why I talk about support employment funds and what funds are used for support employment. And I got a couple of them defined by titles, Title 6 and Title 1. And Title 6 supported employment, um, South Dakota is a minimum allotment state, and we get $300,000. And to let you know, we spend more than $300,000, but anything we spend above that has to use our basic VR funds, or we use our Social Security reimbursement funds, or we use some other state funds into there. Our Title I basic funds is what we are typically funding for helping a person go to college, assistive technology, other things like that that are not supported employment. Our support employment funds are typically going for like job coaching services for providers. And I'll talk a little more in a minute how we utilize those funds. And the providers may never see the difference on the funding source. If you ever looked at the authorization in the upper corner, it'll probably tell you if it's supported employment or if it's 110, which is the basic VR funds. But the, the money to the provider is all the same. It's green. VR counselors and our clerical in the field need to have a better understanding of the funding sources and the requirements onto there, because supported employment, to utilize those funds, there are certain requirements that have to be met. Okay, the Title VI support employment funds, they can only be used for individuals that we determine are supported employment, and they are eligible VR clients. So these are individuals with the most significant disabilities who will need long-term support or could not maintain employment without supports. One of the changes that happened with the most recent regulations is supported employment can only be used for the job coaching and services when a person is on a job. We used to authorize situational assessments, job placement, job coaching, and like some maybe follow along all of one authorization. But when this change came about, they said supported employment funds could only be used for when the person has a job. I also want to mention, um, sound just went out. Okay, hold on. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you guys. I don't know what it is. All of a sudden, this headset, it just like it loses a connection. I'm using a wireless headset, and it gets funny sometimes. So, I mentioned about the $300,000 that half of it has to be used for youth with disabilities, where there is a match. The rest of the funds, it was 100% match, and we handle this all internally. Um, in the state office, we kind of run a report of authorizations that are individuals that are 25 to receive these services, and then we split the match and all the good stuff. And again, if we run out of support employment funds, we utilize the 110 funds, we call them. And after I get through explaining this whole complicated process, one of the things that has happened is with the budget not being finalized, supported employment funds for federal fiscal year 18 have not been approved. And they may not be approved. We're not really sure right now. Our federal fiscal year runs October 1st to September 30th. And we are now February 5th, and there is no federal budget. And what happened is when that situation happened, I'm not quite sure the reason, there were certain types of money that weren't included to be renewed. And supported employment was one of those. And again, for South Dakota, that was $300,000. Now, they keep continuing to do what they call a continued resolution that will fund state government the way, or not state, federal government and all those expenditures the way we have been. They set a date, and that next date is February 8th. So that'll be Thursday at midnight. If they can't come to a solution on a budget, then they go to the federal, they go through a shutdown process. But during this whole 4 months going into 5 month situation now, the 2018 supported employment funds have not been released to the states, and I'm not sure if they're going to. So these new requirements they have for the youth, and the match, and all that stuff may not be an issue at all. We were able to track this before, so we're kind of just waiting to see what happens or what shakes out with this. Okay. What is support employment? Well, first of all, it has to be competitive integrated employment. And it says including customized employment. And I kind of argued this with the feds a while back, because typically customized employment happens prior to the job, but there is always some potential that person gets on a job and you're doing some customizing from there. I don't know, but the person has to be meeting the requirement of that competitive integrated employment that we earlier defined into there. Um, the person has to be individual, the most significant disability, and this is something that the VR counselor makes that determination. And I will talk about the short-term basis situation in a further slide. This is a new language that came about, and I haven't really talked to the VR counselors a whole lot about it because it's probably just more confusing than anything, but I will address it and define it here in a few minutes. And again, the employment can be individualized and customized on individual strengths and interests, including ongoing supports. Now, again, I want to clarify that whether it's our traditional VR funds, the Title I, or our support employment, VR is a time-limited program. We cannot fund indefinitely for the supports for a person to get or be maintaining on that job. Okay, who does support employment serve? I'm going to make sure I didn't skip over a couple things here. Page up. Okay. Okay, who is eligible for supported employment? And they have to be eligible for the VR program. So every supported employment client is always eligible for the voc rehab program. Not every VR client, though, is eligible for supported employment. I mentioned earlier, individual has to have the most significant disability that's determined by the VR counselor, and we identify that support employment is their employment outcome on our individual plan for employment. And our counselors designate when they're doing plans if this is a person who is supported employment or not. And if the person is supported employment, they're also designating what is the support that's going to keep them on a job once their employment ends. Okay, how South Dakota funds support employment services. Um, in South Dakota, we issue authorizations, and when a person is determined eligible for VR and support employment, we will issue the authorizations that to the providers, such as job coaching or follow along or some job placement sometimes in units of services. So it's specific for this client, Mary Jane, these many hours of job coaching. Some states will authorize a package, an X amount for an individual, and but we have found traditionally that it works better for us just to being able to authorize and approve the level of services that a person may need for the job or to get the job. And this allows for people who may need more intensive services to be able to receive those more intensive services, or even if there's some traveling involved, those services involved into there. So we authorize them, and the provider delivers the services and submits invoices to make those payments. Again, if you'd ever look in the upper corner of the authorization, you may see whether it's used in supported employment funds or if it's used in just a basic 110 VR funds. It's probably more important for the VR counselors and support staff to know that and follow that, but providers, it's really not as much a big issue onto there. Another thing is I do want to mention that our authorizations, we will estimate the hours of support services a person may need. So if it's 50 hours of job coaching and only 30 is provided, then you bill for only 30. If there is 70 hours that is needed, when you're approaching the end of the 50, you need to get a hold of the counselor and let them know and the reason why onto there. Another 20 hours may be needed. I believe in most situations, the counselors and the providers have a good working relationship and a level of trust into there. Years ago, when I started, I came across the file that the VR counselor was authorizing 1 hour of job coaching every time. And not only did they have to do a new authorization every time, they had a new plan amendment for 1 hour. And I said, why don't you just put all these together and put 20, 30, 40 hours, whatever it may need. And this was an individual with intellectual disability who probably needed some pretty good supports. And back then, it's probably more of a trust issue they needed onto there. But I think most of it we're past the trusting, and we have good relationships onto it. The key thing is to have good communication between the VR counselor and the provider, and reports of information and accuracy and the billings onto there to show us what hours have been provided. I do want to address other VR services that are available to individuals, and we will tend to use what we call Title I funds on to these services. That's going to be like the job placement or the situational assessments. It's literally going to be any services that individuals may need to obtain or maintain their employment. So sometimes it might be assistive technology, sometimes it might be clothes for the interview or the job. It might be other skills training. There is just a variety of other services necessary for VR employment that the counselor would put on the individual plan for employment. That has to happen first versus us doing the authorization. There were some changes that came about with the reauthorization Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act that I do want to go over into there with everyone here. First of all, I don't know if even people realize that there was a time frame that was always established for the most amount of time we could fund for supported employment of job coaching, which was in the past 18 months, and that was moved to 24 months. This probably is more significant for states that did a package situation that said, okay, $5,000 for everything. And of course, what happened then is people with easier, less services got put in supported employment, where people who had more significant disabilities were not getting into supported employment. I do want to mention that South Dakota has traditionally been a very high percent, and I believe they're like the highest state in the country with all of our successful closures. The percent of them that were considered supported employment. So, and I believe that has a lot to do with the way we authorize and fund services being individually onto there. One of the changes was also that competitive integrated employment, and that had to be a requirement of the outcome onto there, or the individual is in competitive integrated employment on a short-term basis. And again, I'll talk about that short-term basis here in just a couple minutes. And also there was a change in support employment funds available for youth with the most significant disabilities. I mentioned up above that we can fund now up to 24 months if it's needed or necessary of job coaching, which we never get to that point because people get stable by then. But if this person is a youth who's like under 25, we can do that for a longer period of time, up to 48 months. This is probably more significant in states that had a waiting list with the developmental disability system. So the person turned 21, aged out of the school funding, and the DD funding was not there available. And so then VR could fund for a period of time in with hoping that the person would be able to get the long-term supports. Um, One of the changes I mentioned a little bit earlier that we had to set aside half of our supported employment funds for individuals who were youth with most significant disabilities, and that had a 10% match involved into it. And we had to reduce the amount of funds that were spent on administrative costs. And in South Dakota, we don't spend any of the supported employment funds on administrative costs. It all goes to direct services. So the $300,000 that South Dakota gets for supported employment was all going for direct services for providers of job coaching type services. Extended time frame for the provision of supported employment. Again, this is at 18 to 24 months. I kind of already addressed that. The short-term basis, I'll read this definition. I'll give you a couple examples. Supported employment is now required to be in competitive integrated employment or employment in an integrated work setting, and where the individual is working on a short-term basis towards that competitive integrated employment. And the best example I can think of is a person. There are some motels in South Dakota that have a 14C certificate, and they are paying individuals less than minimum wage. There's only a few of them out there. So let's say they had a person who was starting a job and it's meeting the requirement of integration, but the person's not working at a speed fast enough where they're being paid minimum wage. And for a period of time, they could be paid less than minimum wage as they work towards achieving that minimum wage. and it has to be within 6 months. Um, or in limited circumstances, it can be up to 12 months. This is honestly the only um, reason example I can think of, because if it was a contracted where through the community support provider or another provider, it would not be meeting other parts of the competitive integrated employment if they were on a provider's payroll. But if they're on a business's payroll, who had a 14C certificate for paying sub-minimum wage, this is the only possibility I could see happening onto there. Requirements for employment outcome for individual support employment. Um, First of all, they must have completed the support employment services, which may go up to 24 months, that we talked about earlier, and identifying. We always identify in the plan for employment that what services the individual needs to maintain that supported employment. So it's usually like ability services is going to provide a minimum of 2 contacts per month as long-term support services is kind of a standard statement we write on the plan for employment. Secondly, the individual's transition to extended services by VR or for the youth. And um, this has always been in the regulations, this transition to extended services. Um, in South Dakota, it had not been a big issue because the individuals are on the long-term funding services when they're coming to us, and they may be involved with developmental disability. They got a case manager, the VR counselor is involved. The process of the funding is seamless, where both fundings may be working together. But there's some states with a waiting list that VR is starting the services, and the funding isn't there for the individuals. And then once the individual gets on that long-term funding, then they call it transition to extended services, and they have to be on that for 90 days. And VR always keeps, we can't close the case until the person's been employed 90 days. A counselor probably could document better that when they put the person in employment, they're on the long-term funding source. But like I said, in South Dakota, they're typically on that long-term funding source right from the beginning, so it's not a big issue into there. The second word you need to put on the survey, if you want continuing education credits, is win. And with that, I got some questions, and someone has, what about independent contractor, such as a newspaper route, as they are paid per paper, and this could take them quite a time to complete. That probably falls into self-employment. And when you look under the employment guidelines for minimum wage and stuff, there's certain things that are excluded, and that newspaper route delivery is one of those things. Another thing that is excluded in the sub-minimum wage, you'll see this once in a while in restaurants and other places where there are tips, is and sometimes even motels too. But let's say our minimum wage right now is $8.85 per hour, but a restaurant is paying a waitress $5 an hour, and when they get to the end of their pay period, let's say it's a week, the combination of that base pay and a combination of that tips has to be minimum wage. And so the minimum wage situation does have some exclusions, and that newspaper route is one of those. So are you asking if we can close them as a competitive integrated employment? I would view it similar to self-employment type closure. And if VR counselor asked that question, let's have some discussion on how to project their earnings. Other questions? Okay, just to clarify, in which scenario a counselor will use supported employment funds for youth other than the client is working in VR is paying for a job coach? Um, we are handling that supported employment funds for youth. All you need to know is just coding the case supported employment or 110 funds. And when we run our reports, our federal reports, we will look at those services paid for job coaching for someone who was under 25 at that time, and that's how we track it. You don't need to track the supported employment youth any separately into there. We will do that. All you need to do for the VR counselors is make sure that they're meeting the eligibility requirements for supported employment, and when you're funding job coaching, you use supported employment funds into that. I know some states
Bernie?
may. Yep.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to ask a question.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Going back to the provider's relationship with the state, are you issuing contracts with this yet, or is it
I
just
I
according
do
to authorization?
well, always authorizations. And what we ran into a while back, there were some providers that were making over a certain amount, and way it's written in the state, and providers are such unique and different onto there that you do your authorizations individually. And we do a letter template. I sent you an email. I don't do that
Hmm.
standard 7, 8 page contract you sign, you send back like we used to. Now we may go back to a contract type arrangement in the future. We're having some discussions on that right
Okay.
now.
But just our authorization's good enough. Is that correct? So, okay, we don't have to be worried about that. And then
No,
would you recommend that we get professional liability insurance as providers, or what are your thoughts on that?
um, I think some may have. Um,
Okay.
I just can't tell you even where to go and stuff like that. I think there may have been some that have in the past, but if someone has some good information on that, if you want to send me some information, I'll forward it on to Laura.
Well, I know the American Counseling Association does, but then you have to join and blah blah blah. So,
Yeah.
I'm just curious if. Okay. Thank you, Bernie.
Other questions?
The second word, are you able to hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I had some kind of a recording on here. The second word of the day was that wind, W-I-N-D, or W-I-N?
WIN. If you watched the Super Bowl last night,
Oh,
you kind of understand.
yep. No, I understand. Okay, I was thinking eagles flying and then wind blowing, so okay. But I got you
If
here.
you get it
Thank you.
close, I'll understand.
Yep, okay.
Other questions? Again, this was some information I was planning on presenting to VR counselors when we do our regular video conferences, trainings monthly, and I just felt there was too much information to try to piggyback on one of those existing ones. And again, all the information I shared today is also, I feel, is important for providers to have that same information and understand that. It may be at a more policy level than providers would care to be at, but I think it's also important for everyone to understand that Bernie in Peer just doesn't make up these rules and change things when he wants to. There's usually a reason behind it, and the definitions. And so, like I said, that's why in the past we may have done some things and fund some things certain ways. We just can't continue that with the changes in regulations. Other questions? I think we had a very good attendance today. I'm showing 91 groups of people. I know some of you guys are doing um, group sites or whatever. There's probably way over 100 people connected onto here, and the video will remain available. I was thinking for like a week, February 14th or something like that, and that is when I will download the survey information, who entered the survey to issue continuing education credits. So make sure you, if other people are going to view the video, I should have it posted by, hopefully by tomorrow. We have a pretty short turnaround of doing this. And like I said, we'll probably get a week for people to view it and also do the survey. But a few weeks past or months past, that's great. You can always view it, but I'm not going to reissue continuing education credits after a week or so. Other questions? I'm here to answer anything you may have. Other questions you may have? Other than it was a great Super Bowl game yesterday, and it's Monday today, and we all got to go back to work. If there's no further questions, I'm going to kind of end the session here and end the recording. Again, I think most people should have my phone number, 773-6284, or you can email me any questions you may have. Or, the supervisors, go to the supervisors on this. Again, the three areas of employment, they get a little more complicated sometime. And again, it's important for everyone to have the same understanding. So with that, I do want to thank everyone for joining today. And I am going to end the recording and the presentation. So have a good day.